But you can use these things to access the library's website, to watch podcasts or listen to podcasts of tonight's program, and most of the other library lecture programs are all available on podcasts at the library's website. You can, if you sign up to get a virtual library card, if you don't already have one, you're able to download ebooks and watch streaming movies on your electronic devices. Programs like tonight and services like you saw on the video are really only possible with the private support that the library gets. In addition to just donating to the library, one of the fun ways to help support the library and have a fabulous time at the same time is to join us at the library's ball this year, entitled Through the Looking Glass, a Wonderland Ball on December 5th here at the library. I'm Mark Dichter, the son-in-law of Meelya Gordon, and tonight's program is part of the Meelya Gordon Memorial Author Program. Meelya was a great theater lover, as many of you, I suspect. Back in the days when Philadelphia was the tryout town for Broadway shows, she belonged to a group called First Nighters and would get to see the shows that went on to Broadway here in Philadelphia. She would be so thrilled if she could have been here tonight to meet our esteemed playwright. The first week Toby and I moved to London in the fall of 2009, we saw a play about the financial crisis called The Power of Yes. That play, as many of other David Hare's plays, such as Stuff Happens and Vertical Hour, present timely and critical analyses of world events. Whenever anyone asks us who's going to London for suggestions, one of the things we always suggest is to check to see if there's a David Hare play on, because we know they won't be disappointed. I also know that many of you saw the recent production of Skylight with Carey Mulligan and Bill Nye in New York. It won the 2015 Tony Award for Best Revival of a Play. David Hare is not only a playwright, but a director and film and television writer. He has more than 30 celebrated plays, many of which have run on Broadway or the West End in London or the National Theatre. His memoir, which you're going to hear about tonight, The Blue Touch Paper, has only just come out. But here's what one review said in The Guardian, one of the best cultural reviewing papers in London. This is throughout an invigorating memoir, an elegantly unvarnished tale. He takes aim at reviewers, modern parents, and Cambridge. There's at least one testy paragraph where he dismisses theater critics en masse, and yet he still can't stop brooding about the critical opinion. And this is because he, in a larger sense of the word critic, is a critic of himself. His plays are critical, his intelligence too. His family religion was judgment, and he's not lapsed. Tonight, David will be interviewed by Wesley Stace, also a best-selling author, and many of you may know him as also a singer and songwriter. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Sir David Hare and Wesley Stace.
Good evening, everybody. How are you? I welcome to the stage David Hare tonight. Just to get the ball rolling, you stopped the book. A, why did you think that this was the time to do such a thing? And B, when you decided to do such a thing, why did you decide that stopping when you stopped in the book was the right place to stop?
Well, it covers the book covers the first 30 years of my life to 1979, and it covers three different things. It covers my private life, my personal life, my becoming a writer and becoming a playwright, and it also covers, in some degree, the sort of social and political history of the period. And at the end of the 1970s, three things happened simultaneously. First of all, I wrote a play with which I was finally pleased, after writing plays with which I was displeased for more or less 8 or 9 years. Secondly, my marriage collapsed, more or less as a result of my becoming a playwright and what was involved in terms of my having to become a quite tricky kind of person based on becoming a playwright. And thirdly, at the same time, Margaret Thatcher was elected. And so my country, which had been, as it were, after the war, heading in one direction, where there was a general agreement about, from parties, you know, both ruling parties, that there was such a thing as the common good, and that the common good had to be represented in the public sector, and that the public sector had to be supported because it was the essential prop of the common good. Obviously, in 1979, that was reversed, and ever since, we've been heading in the exact opposite direction. So if you were born like me in 1947, then your life neatly splits into two halves, politically at least. And so that was, you know, but the reason I wrote it was simply because I've spent my whole life writing about the outside world. If I've, you know, been known for anything, it's for bringing abstruse or difficult material into the theatre. I've written about the Chinese Revolution, I've written about aid to the Third World, I've written about the privatization of the British railway system, not an apparently promising subject. I've written about the war in Iraq, I've written about the financial crisis, I've written about a slum in India under the pathway of the jets that land at Mumbai airport. None of these are subjects that are, as it were, conventional evening out in the British theatre. And so, because of that, my interest has always been in the world, in looking at the world, and never in looking at myself. But I wrote a play about my education about 4 years ago, a play called South Downs, which was a play about when I was growing up. And the actors in it, who were obviously in their late teens, just thought I was describing a world that had completely vanished. And they were just totally disbelieving. And they said, did people really behave like that? Is that really what the 1950s and 60s in Britain were like? And it was as distant to them as Proust to me, or Victorian England to me. It was just a completely vanished world. And I thought, I better write about this quickly because nobody else has, and I need to get it down on paper.
Tell me about the process of that. Was it you versus a typewriter or a computer?
No,
or?
I'd never written about myself, and I had a horror of it. My mother taught me that you must never talk about yourself, that it's rude. And, you know, you must never draw attention to yourself.
Is that her greatest influence on your playwriting?
No, she hated my becoming a playwright. She just thought it could never... you know, my mother basically thought that you should keep your head down and be as inconspicuous as possible. I had a suburban childhood in which the primary ethic is stay low, keep out of sight, and don't do anything to draw attention to yourself. It's rude, so don't do it. So therefore, when I became a playwright, she was absolutely horrified because it could only attract trouble, which indeed it did. And she, you know, whenever, you know, I found after her death that she had collected in a scrapbook all my worst reviews, and there were, you know, there was a book full of these absolutely atrocious attacks on me, which did absolutely prove her point. That, you know, it could cause nothing but trouble to do things in public.
But what, do you think that was because she had purposefully picked those kind of reviews, or is in fact, does that sum up the early attitude towards you in Britain in a way that has been very influential on you kicking against the pricks?
Yeah, well, the book is partly about the 1970s, and those of us who wanted to make the theatre serious and bring into the theatre all this subject matter that I'm talking about. You know, nowadays, when young people write plays, by and large, they're encouraged. You know, by and large, critics, even if they don't like the play, kind of go, well, you know, this isn't terribly good, but on the other hand, this person's 21 or 22 or 23, and they're just setting out, and they're trying, you know, they're trying terribly hard, and of course, you know, good luck to them, and it's wonderful that the young people are writing plays, and isn't that marvellous? That, you know, now they wanted to strangle us at birth. They literally wanted to club us to death the minute we began, and they did. I mean, Bernard Levin once ended a review of my work with the words, "I wish David Hare would just go away," and that was their attitude. And it was a time of intense cultural dispute, the 1970s, and you know, this was war, and it was a culture war that was fought with equal vehemence on both sides.
And that must have made your position more entrenched, as their position was more entrenched in an oppositional way.
Well, you certainly did know that, you know, you could not mistake the fact that you were working in very, very choppy water. I mean, the phrase I always use about it is that you felt that you were sailing upwind. You know, I didn't sail downwind, meaning write something where I felt the audience wanted it, for probably 15 years as a playwright. And I suddenly wrote a play where I thought...
Which one was that?
When I wrote Pravda, which was a play with Howard Brenton, and the two of us wrote it, and it was essentially a satire on Rupert Murdoch, and the audience started laughing at the first line. There was sort of a line, and there was a burst of laughter, and Howard turned to me and said, "That line isn't funny." And I said, "I know it's not funny, but I've got a funny feeling the audience want this play." In other words, the audience hate Rupert Murdoch as much as we do, and they've been longing for there to be a play about Rupert Murdoch, and now there is a play about what a completely vile person Rupert Murdoch is. They're very, very happy. And that was the first time I ever felt they were happy. But up till then, every play I'd ever written, the attitude with which the audience came was, "Impress me. Come on, I'm not convinced. Show me. Convert me. Pull me over to..." And that's the attitude they came with, and it was always a matter of winning them over, at which I might or might not succeed, but they were not well disposed. And I'm not talking just personally, they were not well disposed to any of my generation who came into the theatre to do the things we wanted to do in the theatre.
Well, here we are, you know, two British men in America. Why don't you, I'm sure some people have read the book, but why don't you just sum up a little bit what the theatre was like and what the appeal to you of doing something different in the theatre was? You know, what the context of your doing something different was?
Well, I mean, all young people want to change the theatre into which they go. The theatre belongs to the young, and we were lucky enough to be able to work to change the theatre when we were very young. One of the saddest things I find about the theatre now is that it's so much more difficult for young people. Remember, you know, I was literary manager at the Royal Court Theatre, which was the principal new play theatre in London, and I was aged 21 when I was literary manager. And the reason I was literary manager was because nobody else wanted the job. And, you know, I was paid £7.10, and I was put, that's £7.10 is what, $14 a week. And I was put in a broom cupboard and, you know, told to read 1,000 scripts a year. Nobody wanted that job. I took that job, and I was 21, and I was able to, you know. Similarly, Peter Brook, remember, was made director of productions at Covent Garden at the age of 23. Peter Hall started the Royal Shakespeare Company at the age of 26. Now you enter in the theatre a career ladder where you are one of 500 people who want to be a director, who want to be a playwright, and you are made to climb some ladder of approval which is dictated to you by middle-aged people. So all I wanted, of course, when I entered the theatre was to destroy the theatre that already existed and replace it with something which was angrier, more confrontational. You know, it was the end of the 1960s, and more anarchic, more political, more feminist. That was also very important. In other words, all the plays were about men. So it seemed to me very important that there be some plays about women.
We'll come back to that.
That was, you know, a great part of what my generation wanted to do in the theatre was to see half the human race represented on the stage and not just the other half, because plays in those days always had a bloke being unpleasant at the centre of the stage and women to whom he was being unpleasant at the side of the stage, and that was called a play. And so changing that was, you know, something we all set out to do.
Going back a little further, what are your, not earliest, but most formative memories of going to the theatre and thinking, this is a thing that I like or could spend some time doing?
Well, you know, we were incredibly spoilt in the sense that I was brought up in Bexhill, which, you know, there's no reason anybody in this room should know anything about Bexhill. But I come from a lower middle class background. I come from a semi-detached kind of background. I was a scholarship boy who managed to get to good schools, private education, simply through scholarships. My parents could not have afforded to send me to the schools that I went to, but I did it because I was bright and passed exams. But in this deadly seaside town, which was of a kind of stifling suburban conformity that is impossible now and is unimaginable, in which people had come back from the war and were in a state of kind of neurotic calm that occasionally exploded with catastrophic results. In that town of 25,000 people, we nevertheless had a repertory company which presented 47 plays in 1957, which is unimaginable. And a lot of them were comedies, and a lot of them were farces, and a lot of them were thrillers. But they also did writers like Hugo Betty and Graham Greene and Jean-Paul Sartre. And you just look at the list of plays and think, well, how can that have been in a seaside town with 25,000 people? But theatre in that way was woven into the way of life that is now, again, something that can't be imagined.
And by the way, I'm from almost exactly the same place in England, just down the road, and though a little younger, I can confirm that nothing had changed by the 60s when I was growing up.
Yeah.
It was the White Rock Pavilion and all kinds of things. Anyway, but can you think of when I was reading the book, you seem both incredibly dedicated, I mean, I'm talking about this early period, becoming a playwright, and also falling into things almost by mistake because there's no one else to do it at the right time.
Well, I only became a writer by chance.
That's for the
I became a playwright because I was running a nasty, agitational, unpleasant theatre group that toured around the country trying to upset everybody. And somebody failed to write a play. And on the Wednesday, they notified me that there would be no play to begin rehearsing the following Monday. So in 4 days, I wrote a play, which was an hour long, which was absolutely terrible. But when the actors held the script in their hand, I could see that they went, okay, I can say this dialogue, I can say this, and I won't look a complete idiot when I say it. And so I discovered that I had a gift. And my gift was for writing dialogue, way before I discovered that I had a gift for writing plays. But I could write dialogue that, you know, was not embarrassing to the actor to say. And so once I stumbled on that gift, and I had no sense that I had it. And so I did fall into playwriting by accident. I thought I was going to be a director. And for many years, I was a director who wrote, and I wrote filling in the gaps in subject matter. In other words, I wrote, the first full-length play I wrote was all women, and I wrote a play about feminism simply because there were no plays about feminism. And similarly, I wrote a play about rock music because there was nothing in the theatre about rock music. And so I kept filling in the gaps, but not admitting to myself that I really was a writer. But I then wrote a sort of anti-capitalist play that was presented in the capitalist West End and was the subject of so much vituperation and critical...
Plenty?
Knuckle.
Knuckle,
And
right.
was the subject of so much critical revulsion and anger that I thought, well, I'm suffering like a writer, I might as well admit I am one.
And am I getting things muddled, or did you kind of leave town after a disastrous first night of Knuckle and head to America or to go traveling?
I ran away.
You ran away?
I did run away. I just could not contemplate. It was too painful to me that, you know, a play that I mean, essentially I wrote satire at the beginning, and the first few plays I wrote were comedies. And then when I wrote a serious play, which was Knuckle, then my agent said
of whom there is a fantastic portrait in your book.
But my first agent, Clive Goodwin, just said to me, you are not a serious writer, and when you try to be serious, it's embarrassing. And he said, you know, you're a comic writer, and the only good thing about you, David, is you don't buy into anything. And if you start becoming one of those moral writers who tells people how to live. You know better than me. There's enough of those in the world already. The world does not need another such writer. And so don't you try and be serious because it doesn't suit you. So I had to sack my agent and get another one.
And your reaction to that, which is a tone that, an attitude that you see throughout you quote somebody, is it Ionesco or someone saying, like, whatever they criticize you for?
No, it's Cocteau who said, it's this wonderful advice to the young writer, which is, that Cocteau gave, which is, whatever they criticize you for, intensify it. And it's so true.
And that's what you did.
I did. In other words, if they were annoyed that I was provocative or, generally, disruptive in the calm of the British theatre, then I tried to be more offensive and disruptive and to intensify that quality. But I suppose what I've understood by writing the book, and this I think is the most important thing I've learnt by writing a book about my own life, is that I'd always imagined that, like most writers, I'd written out of anger. And I actually quote Philip Roth, who said another wonderful thing, which is, he said, a writer has to be made angry in order to see. And I'd assumed, because I came from an angry generation, that anger motivated me. And playwrights, when I first began to meet them, were very angry people. If you met Harold Pinter, you could have a rough old evening with Harold Pinter. In other words, it was up and down. He was an abrasive figure. John Osborne was an abrasive figure. Edward Bond was an abrasive figure.
Are those people, technically, they're a generation?
A generation above me.
So what did they have to come up against to get what they had to come up? You were benefiting from some of their anger, weren't you?
Yeah, but they had also survived extreme critical hostility.
Right.
Harold Pinter entered the theatre. His first play, The Birthday Party, opened on a Tuesday and closed on a Saturday, to almost universally terrible reviews, except one champion, Harold Hobson, in the Sunday Times. And apart from that, it was just universally derided as being completely ridiculous.
Right.
So that's the theatrical life. If you want to be a playwright, that's what you're going to face. The original... People say they want original work, but when actually you give them original work, it turns out they don't want it. It turns out that they're shocked by it, and they find it ugly. They found Waiting for Godot ugly. They found The Birthday Party ugly. They found Look Back in Anger ugly. That's how The Rite of Spring, clearly, which we now regard as the greatest musical work of the 20th century, people can't recreate what happened on the first night of The Rite of Spring, or what happened on the first night of the Threepenny Opera. These things, the audience recoils at these things because they're just so shocking when they first happen. Then, as the years go by, they're absorbed. So actually, you're up, if you're going to write original stuff, you're going to sail into very, very rough water, particularly when you're unknown. And so the previous generation had been through it and had left them very raw people, very difficult, ornery, complex, uncomfortable people.
Everyone's out to get me people.
Yeah. Which they never lost, or indeed Tennessee Williams, even, who I say in the book, who became a friend of mine when I was in my late 20s. And I spent a lot of time with Tennessee Williams, who regarded himself as completely rejected by the American theatre, who could not get his plays performed in New York, who regarded himself as forgotten, a man who'd once written some famous plays, he said, but which were now regarded as boring and old hat, and who could now not get his contemporary work in the late 70s on in New York because the critics hated him so much. And that was the theme of his conversation, more or less from 9:30 every evening till 2 o'clock every morning. And I spent many evenings just simply as the witness to this monologue on this subject. If you now told Tennessee Williams that he is probably the most highly regarded contemporary playwright in the world and performed all over the world and regarded as this astonishing American classic, he would be amazed. He died believing that he'd failed.
I was going to ask you about Plenty, but I can't exactly remember the question I was going to ask you, and it's down here. You said in one of the things, oh yeah, I know exactly what it was. You said in one of the, I just want to ask you about the specific line. You said, you know, men were offended. So what year was it on in London?
1978.
And then it was revived 20 years later. Men were offended because there's that scene in which she uses a man to get pregnant with, you know, right. Was that, did you mean people muttered about it in the foyer, or do you mean people booed as the scene happened?
Oh, no, nobody booed at the scene.
But people did boo at your plays, did they?
Yeah, of course.
But people don't boo at your plays anymore.
No.
Do people boo at the theatre?
I quite miss it.
Yeah, I thought you would. Well, that's the question I'm getting around to answer. Do you think that a lot of, you know, those were exciting times, the booing times, and do you...
Yeah, but what I'm saying in the book is the 1970s were disputatious times in the culture, but they were also disputatious times in society, meaning that in Britain, at least, we had, you know, the 3-day week.
Right.
We had, you know, blackouts. The electricity supply and the gas supply were not solid. They kept going. There were strikes going on that meant that, you know, the energy supply was threatened. Governments came and went. They ran, Edward Heath went to the country asking the question, who runs Britain? And he got the reply, not you, and somebody else was elected. So there was it was a permanent state of crisis and drama. But the crisis and drama and the dispute that was going on in the culture and in the politics was about very important things. And these were passionate arguments about things that actually matter. And so, unfortunately, history belongs to the victors. And so, the story that is told of our little island is that Britain was complete chaos until 1979 when Margaret Thatcher came along and set it right. And that, in every single newspaper, British newspaper, is now the story. And to historians, that is the story. But one of the things the book is trying to do is reclaim the 1970s and say, look, these arguments were conducted at fantastic human cost, and I'm only one of the people who got very, very damaged by these arguments, meaning that the vehemence of the attacks against me were horrible. You know, they were not. They made me a very uncomfortable person to live with. But having said that, it was because we were arguing, and I find the quiescence now, the way in which it is generally accepted throughout Britain, I can't speak for America, but throughout Britain it is accepted that neoliberal capitalism is the only way, deregulated markets are the only way, this is the orthodoxy, if you stray from the orthodoxy you must be mad or just unrealistic. That there is no longer dispute in the way that there was in the 1970s about, yeah, and you know, you have to say after the financial crash of 2007-8 that it turns out neoliberal capitalism, as followed by the laws of Milton Friedman, may not turn out to deliver eternal human happiness. But to say that in Britain is now more or less impossible.
You know, you refer to yourself as filling in some gaps where you thought things needed to be written, as picking some abstruse subject matters, as writing about things that weren't necessarily what people wanted. Okay. But in some of the most affecting passages in the book that I've got a few quotes from here, it's you talking about random visual images that set off plays for you. And one of your great discoveries, there's a great passage that's a whole page where one of your great discoveries is that you're out of control when you write. How do those things go together? Because you seem such a playwright from the outside, because of the subject matter, you seem such a playwright of will, and yet to get into the book, what's, I think, moving about it is that a lot of it is, you know, from the ether somehow, and you don't have as much control over it as...
Well, it's very difficult to explain to people that a political artist is an artist just as much as someone who writes about other things. And so, you know, I made this primary discovery when I first tried to write a play, which was that I had no control over it whatsoever, meaning that, you know, my intentions didn't really come into it. It wrote itself from my imagination, and various things. You know, the usual thing is to say in a play, oh, the characters take over, they do what they want, and it's not what the author has planned. But it would be truer to say that the whole play takes over. Every entrance and exit, every scene, every change in the story, every change in the mood pleases you or displeases you for reasons that you cannot begin to explain, any more than Francis Bacon can explain why, in his opinion, the canvas looks better if he puts a green blob in that corner, and he puts a yellow blob in that corner, and he puts a red blob in that corner. And then it's finished because it's got the red and the yellow and the green in the corner. But why is the red and the yellow and the green in the corner? Francis Bacon has no idea. The mystery of style is a mystery. I can't explain to an actor who paraphrases my words, and I have to say, I'm sorry, but you can't paraphrase that line. And the actor will say, well, hang on, it says exactly the same thing. If I say it that way, I'm still saying exactly the same thing. And I would say, yeah, but the rhythm doesn't please me in the way the rhythm of my original line pleases me. To which the actor may say, well, what the hell does that matter, whether you're pleased by the rhythm or displeased by the rhythm? That's not my problem, you know. To which you say, on the contrary, you know, your job is to fulfill my style, and my style depends on that rhythm, and you have to obey that rhythm. And if you don't, you won't, unfortunately, convey the meaning that I intend to convey. And these things are bound up. So because of that, and because you don't have control, people get very offended because they think I'm a political writer, and they say, well, will you please now go off and write about this? The most important subject to write about today, somebody will say to you, is melting ice caps. Can we please have a play from you on melting ice caps?
Somebody actually said that?
Yeah. Oh, for goodness sake. I mean, I am constantly asked to write on self-consciously important subjects, do you see? Because you are a political writer, therefore you're a short-order cook. You can do hot dogs, you can do burgers, you can do Italian cooking, you can do tandoori. Obviously, you can run up a play on anything because you're a political writer, and so your political intention must be what makes you creative. So to explain, no, a political writer is as much a prisoner of their imagination as any other kind of writer. When I'd written a play about the Chinese Revolution, a producer said to me, absolutely fantastic play about the Chinese Revolution. Could you do one about the Russian Revolution now? And I said, no, the Chinese Revolution profoundly stimulates me as an artist, but the Russian Revolution absolutely doesn't stimulate me. But I cannot explain to you why, because affinity between subject matter and artist is something which is, we know from the history of art, completely mysterious.
Has anybody actually, have you had a commission like that? Where, and there's other bits in your book where you reach a point where you just go, I'm not going to worry about these things anymore, and it's going to make my life way easier, and I'm now happy to just be a writer and write. But are there times when people have come to you and said something like that, and you have thought about it and said, actually, yes, I can do something with that?
I think that what I suppose, and if I say this, it sounds over-organized, and it's not really the way I'm thinking when I'm writing. But I suppose that if I look back on it, then I can't write about something that's just itself. In other words, if I write, for instance, I mean, I'll tell you the example, is the one about the privatization of the railways. I wrote a play about the privatization of the British railway system. And what happened after the railway system...
Name of play being?
The Permanent Way. And actually, immediately after the railways were privatized, there were 4 absolutely catastrophic rail crashes in Britain, which were or were not linked to the privatization in ways that were very difficult to prove, that maybe in public ownership the railways were safer, but maybe they were. So a director who loved railways asked me, and he was one of those people who has recordings of trains going up hills, you know, and particular engines, and can say to you, that is the diesel chug of the, you know, famous Derby-made engine. And, you know, as far as he was concerned, it was heaven. He was writing, you know, I was going to write a play about railways. And I'm kind of going, I'm not really totally fascinated by railways. I like going by train, but I sort of don't care what kind of engine is driving the train. It doesn't really interest me or affect me emotionally. The British are very emotional about trains. They have a sort of curious relationship to trains, and I don't. I lack that. And then I slowly began to realize, as we were writing the play, that the people who we were workshopping the idea of the play, and I was going, Max, I can't write this play. I can't write it. There's nothing to write about. I don't know anything that I want to say about the British railway system. And then in came, first of all, people who had survived the rail crashes, and then in came the families of people who had lost family members in the rail crashes. And I realized that their attitudes to grief were completely different. In other words, to a point where they could not, a year on, agree how to commemorate the event. Because anyone who had survived it essentially wanted to move away from those events, whereas anyone who had lost somebody in them wanted to move back towards them. And there was a woman who had lost her son so completely that they couldn't even find a piece of DNA in the crash to confirm his identity. And when you realize that all she wanted was a kind of vindication through the investigation, then you go, okay, I'm writing a play about grief. I'm not writing a play about railways. And once you realize that, and different attitudes to grief, then you're in a subject which has absolutely nothing to do with the railways. You're just using the railways. If I write about the railways, it's journalism. But if the metaphor is a metaphor that has universal application, then a friend of mine, an American, came out of the permanent way in floods of tears. And I very stupidly said to this American, oh, I didn't realize you cared so much about the British railway system. And he replied, I saw the play entirely as being about AIDS. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, because it is about the question, which was the question that haunts us who lived in New York in the 1980s, which is how many people had to die and how many people didn't have to die, how much suffering was necessary and how much suffering was unnecessary. So in other words, he found in that subject a metaphor which applied to a whole load of things beyond the railways. So that's what art is. The other thing is journalism.
When you go through your plays in that way, and they are known to be about certain things, without being, schematic about it, are they all about another thing that you can also identify what that thing is? And did you go in with that thought, or does that thought emerge through the workshopping process?
That's exactly, that is exactly what happens. In other words, you write about something and then you go, oh, I'm not writing about this, I'm writing about something much, much bigger. But that only comes to you as you're working. And I just would like to say in America, because it struck us so deeply, that when you had that 9/11 investigation afterwards, and having worked on the rail crashes, then there's this incredible shot of Condoleezza Rice going into that and not wanting it to admit or bend at all and take any responsibility for what happened on 9/11. And actually Richard Clarke, who had been the man in charge of national security, and it wasn't even on his watch that 9/11 happened. It was in the months, he resigned in the months, but knowing that something was going to happen. And he actually, on the way out, touched the families of the bereaved. And it's one of the most moving things I've ever seen in public in my life. And having worked on those train crashes, to see somebody, a public official, take responsibility in that way. He stood up and he said, yeah, it was our fault because we knew something like this was going to happen and we didn't do anything about it. And I'll live with that for the rest of my life. And then as he went out, he just trailed his hand across the bereaved. Well, I just burst into tears when I saw that, because I thought that is all the bereaved of the train crashes in England were waiting for, and they never got from the Labour government.
We're going to go to question and answers after. I'm going to ask one more question, and then when we do have the questions, even if we can hear you, do speak into the microphone that will be coming near you, because then it can be heard on the podcast as well. One more question before we do a little brief one while they're thinking up their excellent questions. A lot of the book is, my judgment on myself was far worse than anybody else's could be. There's a lot of pretty self-lacerating honesty in the book. You refer to yourself as having a reputation as being ruthless and arrogant. You nod very happily at that. But sitting here with you now, it's difficult to imagine. There's a wonderful letter in the book from Tom Stoppard to you, talking about your reputation for that, and Harold Pinter's for that, for being difficult. Where do you think is that just part of your personal makeup, or was that the fight that you had to fight?
I think that I'm absolutely mystified by those...
Or do you think you're not that?
No, I mean, I'm mystified by people who have responded to this book by saying, you're very hard on yourself. And I kind of go, well, I'd sort of assumed that self-hatred and self-doubt motivated most of the human race. But it turns out to be that there are people who do not enjoy a moment of self-doubt and who live in this state of complete, I mean, most of them, needless to say, are journalists, but they appear to live in this state whereby they do not, in that murmuring monologue that goes on in your head 24 hours a day, they do not appear to criticize their own behavior at all. And they appear to be completely blithe about how they go through life. And all I can say is, if you are a stranger to self-hatred, then I'm extremely happy for you. It must be the most wonderful life you live. But this, I don't think I'm particularly harsh on myself in the book, but so many people have said it to me that I assume there is another category of human being which I didn't know existed.
People you know have said it to you?
Oh, yes. People say, oh, you're very tough on yourself in the book. And I suppose my answer to that is just to say, well, I suppose I've tried to make the book true. I know this is a ridiculous aim, but it's not the complete truth, meaning that a lot of stuff has been left out about those 30 years. But I have gone to immense lengths to make sure that everything that is in the book is true.
It's true.
And this is an unbelievably exhausting process to try and make that so. But I've only been, as it were, caught out in a couple of factual errors, tiny factual errors.
Did you keep journals?
Yeah.
You did. Okay, so I must stop asking questions, because you must start. Who's got a question? There you go.
Great.
There's one right there.
I enjoyed the wonderful production of Skylight recently on Broadway. Would you comment about your impression of the difference of theater in London and theater on Broadway?
No. I mean, what do you want? That I should be lynched? What do you wish? Whenever we speak about this, whatever any Brit says, people take offense.
She wants an honest answer about your feelings. Now, we're off podcast now. No one can hear you.
Okay. What I would say is, look, America dominates to a point of subjugation the movies. It dominates television to a point of subjugation. It dominates popular music to a point of subjugation. And, there is one art form in the English-speaking world in which another country actually is able to do some reasonable work. I'm not saying better work, but when you then go to New York and you get all this anti-Brit sentiment, you just go, look, art forms are meant to be international. You are allowed to have other cultures that produce other things, and you should not be threatened if things arrive which, maybe are different from the local product and have a different emphasis from the local product. What could possibly be wrong with that? But we have multiplexes in England where 15 out of the 16 films are American. You know, we have that, and you know, similarly on television, on major channels every night, it's American shows every night. And we don't say, you know, well, I think finish these sentences for yourselves.
There's one over here.
As someone who has enjoyed using Via Doloroso, I'd be interested to hear what projects you're working on for the future that might be similar to that.
Oh, I don't think anything will ever be similar to Via Dolorosa. No, I went to Israel and Palestinian territory, as it was then called, in the late 90s, commissioned to write a play about the Mandate period. But I was so completely shocked and amazed by what I saw that I just came back wanting to tell the world about what I'd seen, because it didn't correspond to the world's picture of Israel or the Palestinians at all. And so I said to Stephen Daldry, who was directing it, that it would have to be a monologue. And because the only way of telling whether somebody's telling you the truth is to see the whites of their eyes, that I would have to perform it. And so Stephen had to teach me to act, really, at the age of 50. And so I went out to do this monologue. And it was, as they say, a learning and growing experience to learn to act at the age of 50. And my favorite review of it was by Simon Callow, who's an extremely accomplished actor. And Simon said, David Hare goes out entirely unprotected by technique, he said.
And of course, you've brought the work of Wallace Shawn to England, didn't you, as well?
Wallace Shawn has always been a passion of mine. And I think that, you know, when we first read Wallace Shawn's plays in England, we just all went crazy about him, and it was all the writers who went crazy about him. In other words, I read him, and then I showed his work to Carol Churchill, who adored it. I showed it to Howard Brenton, who adored it. And so Wally, who had had nothing but incomprehension with his first plays at the Public Theatre in New York, came to England and discovered there was this cache of performed playwrights who thought he was great. And I don't think anybody got the idea of him until My Dinner with Andre. And then obviously when he wrote My Dinner with Andre, everybody got the idea of how original and brilliant he was. But yeah, he was somebody that we all really stuck our necks out for. And when I was running a theatre group, then we did Wally's extremely obscene and difficult plays. And I've directed his work as well in London. And I love his work. I think he's brilliant.
Another question. Right at the very... Oh, there. You're too far away back there.
I cheated. I read the book over the summer. I found a galley copy of it, and it was really good before this nice hardcover came out.
I'm glad.
Why does there seem to be a love-hate relationship with the National Theatre amongst theatre professionals? That's a question. And what do you think of NT Live, that showing the theatre over here in cinemas?
Well, the question of the building of the National Theatre, it had always been radicals who wanted, you know, it had always been progressive people, Granville Barker, Bernard Shaw, who'd started the National Theatre movement. And the point of having a National Theatre in Britain was to remove art, to make theatre an art form independent of commercial forces. In other words, Bernard Shaw and people at the turn of the century just looked around and said, this art form will never be any good unless you free it of the obligation to make money. And that's how it's going to get to be good. And that had always been a progressive cause. But by the time, at the end of the 1960s, that the National Theatre came to be built, then the left, or progressive people, had swung round completely and decided that a National Theatre must be an establishment theatre, and it could only represent the views of the elite and the establishment. So if, like me, you were working on the fringe and you wanted to work at the National Theatre, you were regarded as a traitor to the cause of alternative theatre because you were going over to an establishment theatre. My argument was the very opposite. Progressive people have always argued for this. It will only become an establishment theatre if we refuse to work there. And why should the people who never believed in a national theatre be the people who end up running it? That can't be to anybody's benefit. Peter Hall was the artistic director, and I argued, look, he'll let us say anything. He's saying, use our stages, you're welcome on our stages, we won't censor you, write plays about anything you want. The first play to open at the Littleton Theatre, you know, the very first new production at the National Theatre, was a Howard Brenton play, which I directed. And 2 years later, I wrote plenty for it. At no point did Peter Hall do anything except support us. So I couldn't understand what the argument, you know, it seemed to me a wonderful thing for there to be a theatre in which the nation could be spoken to from its stage. What a fabulous thing. Why would you be frightened of that? What, you know, were you so insecure that you didn't think you could survive in a place that had 800 seats or 1,200 seats? You know, that, it just seemed to me a sign of weakness to not want to work there. But of course, to a political movement that was very tied to its own integrity and its own idea of itself as being separate from the mainstream, it became the enemy. And those arguments about my working at the National Theatre were among the most bitterest, the bitterest arguments of the 70s, for those of us who did. What do I think of NT Live? I just wish that the NT still toured. And I think that, you know, in the book I described the days when it did small-scale touring. And much as I know that people love seeing these plays, and I know that it's aesthetically a lot better than it used to be, and I get letters from all over the world from people who've seen Skylight or who've seen Behind the Beautiful Forevers, I know that it's wonderful that people all over the world can see these things, but I don't want it to replace the obligation of the National Theatre in Britain, which is to be the nation's theatre, not just London's theatre. And I think touring has suffered terribly in Britain since this alibi for touring has been produced, which is, you know, filmed plays.
We had a question right at the very back of the hall. I shall just keep talking for a second until... Here we go.
Hi.
Yes.
I find myself wondering whether, having written a memoir about your own life, obviously, has changed your attitude about your work or your perception of the writing that you do. Has it had an impact on you that you're aware of?
Yeah, I think in two ways. One, as I say, I think that I realized I didn't write out of anger. I wrote out of bewilderment, and that's a different thing. And I had never realized that. In other words, the theme of the book, or the continuing theme of the book, is everybody else understands the rules and I don't understand them. I'm not against them. I'm not a rebel. I'm not an anarchist. But I really just don't get the rules. And I think that, therefore, a play for me has always been a sort of proposition. I've always been saying, now, this is the way I see the world. Does anybody out there recognize what I'm talking about? And when I've written a successful play, you see this light go on in their eyes, in the audience's eyes, and this sort of gratitude where they go, oh, this is great. Somebody's finally saying what I think. And they're saying it in a way which I couldn't put it, but it's there in front of me, something I recognize. When I've written an unsuccessful play, you get the sense from the audience of a complete blank, and why does he think this is interesting and important? It doesn't seem interesting and important to me at all. So bewilderment, to me, has been as much of an artistic spur as anger. And I only realized that by writing the book. But I also would say that it's made me much happier. I really recommend writing a memoir. It makes you terribly... I think that the past creates an anguish and an ache, particularly if you were born at a difficult time, had a difficult childhood, and, you know, that ache becomes more painful with the years, not less painful. And I think I have dispatched the ache for myself by writing the book. So at some level, I'm not saying I don't care that other people read the book. I'd love to sign your copies, and I'd love everybody else to read it. But something primary for me has happened by writing this book, which is I've rid myself of a terrible backlog of unhappiness. And it has discharged it for me by writing it. I'm much happier. And I never thought writing anything could make me happier, but it has.
Do you think that's wonderful? Do you think that makes the idea of a continuation of it? Because obviously
there's no continuation of it.
Hearing you say that made me think not.
I can never write the next bit, because that is a story. The people who've pleased me most are the people who've said to me, this book is like a novel. And I tried to make it as much like a novel as I possibly could. In other words, it's got narrative and it's got character, and everything in it is relevant to the story. I don't go into irrelevant stuff. In other words, there isn't a bit about, this is when I met, I don't know, Martina Navratilova, or
fascinating.
Exactly. It's not a ragbag of this happened, then this happened, and this happened. Yeah. It's a narrative like a novel, and it's as near to a novel as I will ever write. And the first half of my life was shaped like a novel, and I realized that when I wrote the book. But the second half of my life has not been shaped like a novel, so I don't want to write about it.
And but there are unexpected cameos. Martina Navratilova not there, but Noel Coward is there.
Yeah, Noel Coward
makes a great remark.
Yeah. Well, Noel Coward came to my first play, and he was so grand that, well, actually, I think he also had emphysema, to be fair to him. That the convention is you visit the dressing room, but he didn't visit the dressing room. He got the actors and me to line up in the foyer. And he shook all our hands, and then when he came to me, he said, the playwright. And then he said, 5 very good scenes and 1 very bad one, he said, about my first play. And he was absolutely right. I couldn't disagree with him. He was dead on the money.
Ladies and gentlemen, one more question. Let's go for it.
Analogous to the question on the National Theatre, what is the place of the Royal Court Theatre in British life?
Oh, what a difficult question. Well, the Royal Court Theatre was the pioneering new play theatre in Britain. And so it was the first big stage, meaning 400 seats, that had a policy of producing new plays. And out of it came a whole generation of brilliant writers. You know, John Osborne, obviously, John Arden, Anne Jellicoe, Arnold Wesker, Edward Bond. You know, there didn't seem to be a month for a while in which, you know, it was not refreshing the British theatre. David Story, by, you know, Christopher Hampton, by discovering some new and brilliant writer. And it had a sort of flare of creativity, I suppose, years that lasted from 1955 to 1975 or something like that, in which it was simply in the vanguard of all British culture. In other words, the novel came to seem very dusty and old-fashioned compared with what was going on in the Royal Court. I don't think any theatre can keep up that pioneering role. And now there are different shops. In other words, at that time, it was the only new play theatre. As I say, I was in charge of reading 1,000 plays a year, and there was nowhere else to send them, really, except to the Royal Court. I mean, the Royal Court was so dominant that I even got, I got sent a play by Agatha Christie, can you believe it, who wanted her play on at the Royal Court. Everybody wanted their play on at the Royal Court. It's almost unimaginable now that a new writing theatre could have that dominance in the culture. But for about 20 years it did. Now you might have, a new writer might have their play performed in one of 20 or 25 theatres in London. And new writing is much more encouraged than it was. But the Royal Court really pioneered new writing for a while. And so it's got a glorious and extremely disputatious history.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you've... Hold on. I'm sure you would like to thank me greatly, and please go up and get your, your copy of Blue Touch paper signed by David Hare upstairs. And I'm sure you'd like to join me in thanking David Hare.
Thank you very much. Thank you.